The Jets' win over the Atlanta Falcons may have hurt their draft position, but if this win came because Adonai Mitchell is developing, it's a very good thing for the Jets. Locked On Jets starts now.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Monday, December 1st, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day, and thanking you for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. A big shout out to you every day, as this is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday, and today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. The Jets beat the Atlanta Falcons yesterday in Week 13 action. We're going to break it all down. We'll talk about who the heroes were for the New York Jets. We'll talk about where Adonai Mitchell can go from here after a stellar performance. And we'll talk about why Jets fans should not be upset, even though they did cost themselves some draft position with this victory. And that's where we will begin. I think whenever you get to this point in the season, there is a debate within the fan base. The Jets are out of the playoff race. They're going to finish the season with a losing record. All eyes are now to the future. And a lot of fans will root against the Jets at this time of year in order for the Jets to get a better draft pick. It's an understandable way to view things. There are also fans who say, you know what, I can't root against the Jets. I want to see the team win. I don't think that there's a right way to be a fan or a wrong way to be a fan. I think that everybody has the team's best interest at heart, no matter where you fall on the tanking debates. Me personally, I think that the debate's a bit overrated. In a typical situation, I don't know that wins really matter all that much this time of year when you're out of the playoff race. And while we obsess over draft positioning, and sometimes it makes a difference, most often there's not really a big difference between the quality of player you're going to take at 7 versus the quality of player you're going to take it for. Yes, there's a year every now and then where there's a transformational player who's available, who goes off the board a pick before you're up. But for the most part, these things don't really make that big of a difference. I think it also depends where you are as a franchise. Last year, the Jets were a very veteran-oriented team. They were a team that had Super Bowl expectations. They weren't really giving young guys much playing time. You had a lot of old guys here who you knew probably were not returning. You knew this time last year, Aaron Rodgers was probably not going to be a Jet in 2025. You knew Devontae Adams was not going to be a Jet. You knew for sure Hassan Reddick was not going to be a Jet. Tyrod Smith was on the injured list, but you knew he wasn't coming back. The Jets core last year was a bunch of older guys, and even winning late season games wasn't really going to change anything for the franchise. This year, things are different. This year, it is a full youth movement. The Jets are in the first stages of a rebuild, and it's a rebuild that got even deeper at the deadline when the Jets sent off 2 of their star players, Sauce Gardner and Quinnen Williams. And I think that for a young team like this, wins are something you can build on. I think that this Jets team might be the exception. I think normally this time of year, you're kind of just trying to talk yourself into wins being important. But I think for a young team, especially a young team that's been through a difficult season, a young team that's frequently been a lightning rod for criticism, it's important for the coaching staff to make sure that their message is getting through, that they win games, because the coaches are telling these guys, you know what? If you keep doing the work, we're going to start getting better results. And I think if you keep losing games, it's easy for young guys to kind of tune that out. Whereas if you win, you start to believe in these guys. You start to believe that these coaches have you moving in the right direction. But even more significantly, I think this is critical. The Jets are playing so many young guys that if they win games, it's a sign that young guys are developing. And this is a very deep rebuild. The Jets were starting from a spot where they had a lot of holes, and they created even more holes by trading Sauce Gardner and Quinnen Williams because they felt that, they were better off just completely tearing it down, completely looking to the future, building around youth, building around draft picks. They pretty much went back to square one. But if some of the young guys on this team start developing, if some of the young guys on this team start emerging, then you know what? You have a foundation to build around. And I think that this Jets team, in many ways, is ahead of your typical team that's starting at square one, because you've got two young tackles who are looking like players. Now, this was a bit of a rough game for Armand Bamboo. He had a penalty, he gave up a sack, but my general feeling watching this game live, and we'll see what the film has to say, is that the Jets offensive line played very well in pass protection. Tyrod Taylor did not seem to me like he was getting the ball out quickly. It seemed to me like he was holding onto the ball for too long. And he was also throwing the ball deep, and the deep plays take longer to develop. And it felt to me like the offensive line did a pretty good job blocking. And I felt for the amount of time Tyrod Taylor was holding the ball, that the fact the Jets only gave up 2 sacks in this game was a legitimate positive. And I think you could also look to the real star of this game for the Jets, Adonai Mitchell. And we'll talk about what this could mean for the Jets going forward a little bit later. But this was an absolutely stellar performance for Adonai Mitchell. 2 weeks ago, it was very easy to write him off. He had a terrible game in Week 11 against the Patriots. There were 3 big plays that were left on the field that on targets to Adonai Mitchell. Now, one of them was a bad throw by Justin Fields, but twice he let a potential game-changing reception slip through his hands. And a week ago in Baltimore, he had like one big catch. He had 2 receptions in the game. One of them was a big catch, but it wasn't really anything about his route running. It was kind of a broken play. It was a schoolyard type play where Tyrod Taylor extended time with his legs using his mobility, and then he found Mitchell, and Mitchell just kind of turned the ball upfield and looked explosive. And that was a sign that Adonai Mitchell has a lot of physical tools. The question is whether he can refine those physical tools, because the NFL is full of wide receivers who are big and fast and strong and athletic who never amount to anything. The wide receiver position is much more about nuance. It's much more about understanding how to run routes. It's much more about understanding how to beat corners. And this was a very, very impressive performance for Adonai Mitchell. Again, this could have big implications for the Jets going forward. We can certainly hope. And Mitchell was kind of just a throw-in the Sauce Gardner trade. We know that the real meat of that trade were the 2 first-round picks the Jets got. That's the reason the Jets made the Sauce Gardner trade. But it may have been a really savvy move, and we'll find out about this in the weeks, the months, the years ahead. It may have been a savvy move for Adonai Mitchell to go to the Indianapolis Colts and say, well, hey, you guys aren't really using Adonai Mitchell. We could use him. Why don't we make him part of the deal? This was a really good performance by Mitchell. 8 catches, 102 yards, a touchdown. And I think it's very clear that in this game, at least, I'm not going to say going forward, we don't know what's going to happen going forward. It was one game. But in this game, he clearly became the receiver Tyrod Taylor trusted when the game was on the line. In a way, John Metchie became that guy last week. You're starting to see Tyrod Taylor develop chemistry with these 2 young receivers the Jets have. So for this Jets team, yeah, maybe they hurt their draft position. They dropped to 7th. They came into this week with holding the 4th selection. There was a path this week if games played out the right way and the Jets lost, and the Jets actually could have had the number 1 pick at the end of the week. Jets fall to 7. You know what? If the Jets end the season at 7, they're going to have a chance to get a great player. It's not like not like these draft classes are 6 players. You're still picking in the top 10. And the Jets will have a chance to draft a quarterback. It's not like all the good quarterbacks go 1 or 2. I think there's a perception when we talk about tanking that the only way to get a franchise quarterback is to draft 1st or 2nd overall. Well, look across the league. Lots of quarterbacks went a lot lower than 7. So even if the Jets win a couple games and drop their draft slot a bit, they're still going to be in position to potentially draft a franchise quarterback. The Jets are building, and it's easy to say it's easy to use that as a cliche this time of year. It's easy to say we're building something for the future. The Jets did that in 2019 with Adam Gase when they started 1-7. They won 6 of their last 8 games. The problem was you didn't see young talent emerging in 2019. You saw the Jets beat up on a soft schedule the late part of the season. They got some lucky wins. And yeah, look, Atlanta's not a great team. But the reason the Jets beat Atlanta in part is because a young wide receiver stepped up. A young wide receiver showed flashes of potential that could have big implications for the Jets going forward. And ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about that wide receiver and those implications. Adonai Mitchell had a potential breakthrough performance against the Atlanta Falcons in Week 13. And if this is signs of things to come, it could be a big deal for the Jets. It could boost the wide receiver position tremendously. We'll talk about all the things Adonai Mitchell could mean for the Jets as we continue here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Game Time. The World Cup is coming back to North America for the first time since 1994. And with 48 teams for the first time ever, it's going to be massive. But let's be honest, getting tickets is usually the hardest part. And that's why the Game Time app is clutch, finally giving fans a real advantage when it comes to snagging seats. With Game Time, you can track price drops in real time, get alerts when great seats open, and buy tickets the moment they hit the app. It puts the power back in your hands and makes going to the World Cup realistic instead of impossible. I use Game Time myself. I used it to go to a Jets game earlier this year in London. I've used it to go see shows on Broadway. I've gone to the U.S. Open tennis with it. It's a great app. You find great deals at the last minute. Every single time, I couldn't believe the price I was paying for tickets. It's just didn't seem possible to get tickets for the price I got them for. I also like that you get the view from your seat. They give you a picture of what it's going to look like from your seat before you buy, so no surprises when you show up at your venue. And they have all in pricing. They tell you what you're going to pay before you pay it. No hidden fees that surprise you at checkout. Game Time's the place to get your tickets. So take the guesswork out of buying World Cup tickets, Jets tickets, anything you want, every match, concert, or event with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, download the app, make an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Swipe, tap, ticket, go. Game Time. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. The Jets beat the Atlanta Falcons yesterday, 27-24 at MetLife Stadium. Jets get their third win of the season. They improved their record to 3-9. And if we're talking about standout performances in this game, I think the first name you have to mention is Adonai Mitchell, the receiver the Jets acquired as part of the Sauce Gardner trade at the deadline. Had probably the best game of his career. 8 catches, 102 yards, including a 52-yard touchdown in the second half. And that was a critical play because on a play-to-play basis, Jets offense really struggled in this game. Now, I know they ended up putting up 27 points, but you have to remember, 7 of those came as the result of a muffed punt that was recovered on the 2-yard line. There was another field goal that was produced by an Isaiah Williams 83-yard return. Jets had 10 points in this game on drives where they gained 2 yards or less. And even the last drive of the game, Jets only had to go 19 yards to get into field position because of the special teams play. We're going to talk a little bit more about special teams play ahead here on the show. The Jets on a play-to-play basis, though, were really struggling on offense. And that touchdown in the third quarter was a key play. It was the first time the Jets offense showed much life in this game. And what was impressive to me was that Mitchell got open deep with ease. I mean, on that play, it looked like the Atlanta corner had a pretty decent cushion, and Mitchell just ran past him. Now, Mitchell's a guy who's clearly got the physical tools to be a quality receiver in this league. I think there's a lot of nuance in his route running that needs work. And it's just little subtle things, a lot of it's, do you break sharply? Do you make sharp cuts? Another thing that I think Mitchell needs to learn is how to use his tempo a little bit on routes. So, an analogy I'd use is a baseball pitcher. If you can throw 100, that's great. But if all you do is throw 100, hitters are going to pick up what you're throwing. You got to learn how to change speeds. The 100-mile-an-hour fastball becomes much more effective when you throw something off speed occasionally. And on the same note, receivers are best when they learn how to kind of slow down and then accelerate. Because if you have that blazing speed and you kind of lull a defender to sleep by running, not slow, but by running less than 100% and then burst, that's really where you can burn guys. But the ease with which Mitchell got open, I mean, he just ran straight past Atlanta's defense. That's really positive. And I think that of the 2 young receivers the Jets have, and who the Jets just acquired at the trade deadline, Mitchell's one, John Metchie's the other. Mitchell's clearly the guy with the higher ceiling. I think Metchie can be a really useful player for the Jets. Now, he had a couple drops in this game. It was an ugly game for John Metchie, but Metchie looked good last week. I think it's very easy to get on a guy after he has a rough game. But you have to remember, if you're getting on John Metchie today, 2 weeks ago, Adonai Mitchell pretty much had the same game. Adonai Mitchell had a brutal game on Thursday night against the New England Patriots. So, 2 weeks ago, Mitchell was doing the same thing Metchie did Sunday. Metchie can bounce back. And we saw Metchie have 2 really solid games leading into this. He had a solid game Thursday night against New England. He had a really good game last week against Baltimore. I think when you're dealing with younger guys who are still developing, you're going to go through some rough games. You're going to have some growing pains. You want to see flashes of potential. We saw flashes of potential with Metchie the previous 2 weeks. In this game, we saw big flashes of potential with Mitchell. And I think that Metchie has the potential to be a quality supporting player for the Jets. He could be a guy who's like a third option, maybe a third option, more likely like a fourth option in the passing game. But those guys are needed. If you want a great passing offense, you need some supporting players. You need some role guys who, are reliable. The role I envision for Metchie is being like that classic slot guy on 3rd and 5. He just finds a soft spot in the zone. You're able to go to him, and he's going to be reliable. I know rough game yesterday, but that's the role I have in mind for Metchie. Mitchell, with his physical tools, can potentially be a starting receiver in this league. Now, I want to throw out a caveat here. Even if Adonai Mitchell's only a number 4 receiver, even if he's a guy who, takes the top off a defense running deep, using his speed in that way, and he's a guy who can fill in for a couple of weeks and throw up the occasional big game, that's an excellent outcome for the Jets, because he was kind of a throw-in in the Sauce Gardner trade. The Jets may say that, we had to have Adonai Mitchell to make this trade. Don't believe them if they say that, though. The meat and potatoes of the Sauce Gardner trade were the first round picks the Jets acquired. This was not a deal about Adonai Mitchell. Adonai Mitchell was a bit of a throw-in in that deal. But clearly the Jets liked his tools. And it was kind of a savvy move to get the Colts to throw Mitchell in, because he was a guy that was kind of sitting on Indianapolis's bench. We know that the Jets did not have a lot behind Garrett Wilson, so the Jets had opportunities for Mitchell to step into the lineup and play and get reps and try and develop. So it was a savvy move. But you don't make this trade expecting Mitchell to break out. You make a trade thinking maybe this guy could be a depth guy, but there's potential for him to be more. And in this game against Atlanta, we saw the potential. Now, can Mitchell become a quality starter in this league? Well, he's got an early draft pedigree. It's not like this was a guy that was drafted in the 6th round. This was an early round draft pick who I think in many ways got caught up in a numbers game in a very deep wide receiver room that the Colts had. And I think that's the reason they were willing to trade him. He of course he had opportunities to show what he could do with the Colts, but there's a lot of talent in that Indianapolis receiver group. Much in the way the Jets got Jawan Briggs from the Cleveland Browns, because the Browns had a lot of talent on their defensive line. These are the types of things that happen sometimes. You have an abundance of riches, so you just get caught up in a numbers game and you don't get an opportunity. The impressive thing about Mitchell was the way it wasn't just that he put up the numbers, it was the way he got the numbers. And yes, as I said earlier, his route running's got to improve. These are things he has to work on. I don't think any player enters the NFL as a purely finished product. I think every player in the NFL has some work they have to do when they enter the league. And Mitchell has to work on his route running. But what I will say is that if he can consistently get open with that degree of ease, it's not as big of a path to develop as a route runner. Because if you can get open that deep, defenses are going to start putting a tremendous cushion on you. And you're going to be open short. And that's what happened in this game, is that Tyrod Taylor was able to find Mitchell open short a lot. And I think a lot of it was because the Falcons were worried about getting beat over the top. So they were giving him a big cushion. They were essentially conceding short completions. And in that situation, you don't necessarily, if you could be a legitimate deep threat, you don't necessarily need to be the greatest route runner in the league to get open. And you don't even necessarily need to run that diverse of a route tree, because Mitchell's big enough to play the X position, which is which is like the traditional outside receiver. He's the guy that lines up on the line of scrimmage. He's the guy that other corners are going to try and jam because he's lined up right on the line of scrimmage. But he's big enough to beat jams, and he could actually be in a dream scenario. And I don't want to get ahead of myself here because it's only one game, and I don't want to declare Mitchell the next compliment to Garrett Wilson on the Jets. But in a world where Adonai Mitchell develops into a quality starter, he could be a perfect complement to Garrett Wilson. Because what are the things Garrett struggles with? Well, Garrett's not really a blazer who can get open deep down the field. Garrett's more of a route runner who shakes defenders with some really unique moves as a route runner. And the other thing Garrett struggles with, I wouldn't say Garrett struggles with press coverage per se, but I'd say Garrett struggles with press coverage against the top press corners. And if you have a guy who can play the X like Mitchell and just line up at the line at the end of the line of scrimmage and he's too big to press, that opens you up to move Garrett Wilson around. You can get him more opportunities in the slot. You can make Garrett Wilson better. And that's the dream scenario right now for Adonai Mitchell. Now, it's important to stack performances. One performance is great, but to be a part of the solution going forward, you got to continue playing well. And the Jets certainly hope that will happen. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about some other guys who played well. It was a big, big day for Jets special teams, and there were lots of standouts who helped deliver a win in a game where most of the Jets offense didn't play that great, and most of the defense didn't play that great. We're going to talk about who helped deliver the Jets this victory as we continue here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. This episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. The holiday season is one of the best times for sports. Bowl games, big basketball matchups, playoff pushes, it's all happening at once. And while we're making choices every day, one of the most fun places to make the right call is Prize Picks. Prize Picks is the easiest way to get in on daily fantasy. Just pick more or less on at least 2 player projections, lock in your lineup, and you're in the game. It's simple, fast, and available in 45 states, including California, Texas, Florida, and Georgia. And Prize Picks has added an extra layer of excitement to the holiday sports schedule. Creating a lineup takes less than a minute, and the app makes the whole process smooth and intuitive. You can choose from a huge range of unique stats: fantasy score, field goals attempted, free throws made, turnovers, whatever fits your strategy. The early payout feature is a great bonus. When your lineup starts strong, you can get the option to cash out early. And the new stacks feature lets you choose the same player up to 3 times in one lineup, like more on a quarterback's passing yards, touchdowns, and rushing yards. Download the PrizePicks app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks. It's good to be right. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Monday. The Jets beat the Atlanta Falcons yesterday 27-24 at MetLife Stadium. And there were a number of heroes for the Jets in this game, and a lot of them played on special teams. So this was a game where the Jets were outplayed in many different ways. The Jets committed 9 penalties. Atlanta only committed 1. The Falcons outgained the Jets 389 to 269. They averaged 5.8 yards per play to the Jets 4.3 yards. Atlanta had 25 first downs to the Jets 16. So you may be asking, well, how the heck did the Jets win this game? Well, there are 3 phases of the game. The Falcons may have outplayed the Jets on offense and defense, with a few exceptions. Of course, Adonai Mitchell had a huge game. But the Jets' special teams won them this game. I think it's fair to say that in 2 of the Jets' 3 wins this year, I think you could also count the game against Cleveland 3 weeks ago, Jets won because of special teams. Jets won because special teams was absolutely standouts. And it happened again in this game. And we can start by talking about Nick Folk, who made the 56-yard field goal as time expired. And this came after Folk missed, really kind of came up short on a 55-yarder earlier in the game. So I think this kick took all of Folk's might. And you have to remember, Folk's career long is 58. So this came close to being his career long kick. Folk delivered it, though, as he's done so many times as a Jets kicker. This is Folk's second stint as a Jets kicker. And a friend of mine texted me yesterday with a question. And I think it's a good question, is at what point do we start considering Folk for the Ring of Honor? As Folk has had a phenomenal Jets career. And it feels like every time you need Folk to deliver a big kick, he makes it. It doesn't matter if he's incapable of hitting a 55-yard kick early in the game. When the game's on the line, somehow he summons what he needs and delivers from 56 yards. Jets fans don't agree on a whole lot. We like to debate. We're a fan base where we have passionate debates. But I think one thing we can agree on as a fan base is Nick Folk is awesome. Nick Folk, once again, the hero, as he's been so many times in his Jets career. I mean, looking back, I think the biggest question with Nick Folk's career is, why did the Jets ever let this guy go? He's just so clutch. He's just so automatic. He delivers whenever you need him to deliver. Really, words fail when you talk about Nick Folk's Jets career. A phenomenal kick by Nick Folk. So let's give him some love. Another guy I'm going to give love, Isaiah Williams. And this is a guy who, you go back to the Miami game week 4, I was not saying such nice things about. And in fairness, he fumbled away a kickoff in that game, and he fair caught a punt on the 3-yard line. And I said the Jets should cut him. Well, the Jets did cut him. They cut him to the practice squad. And Williams has done a great job working his way back to the lineup. And in the second half of this game, and again, a game where the Jets offense was, I think it would be charitable to say it was erratic, Williams sparked and essentially handed the Jets a field goal with an 83-yard kickoff return. Jets only gained 1 yard on the series, but they were already in field goal range. In this game, the Jets had 2 scoring drives where they moved the ball 2 yards or less, and that was a credit to special teams. Isaiah Williams feels like every week he's breaking a big return. Between him and Kene Nwangwu, Jets have a couple really good return guys. Special teams carried the day for the Jets. I'm going to give Qwan'tez Stiggers some love. Now, Stiggers fell on a muffed punt in the first half that set up the Jets' first touchdown. And, I think when you recover a kick in some ways, when you recover a fumble in some ways, you're kind of like in the right place at the right time. But Stiggers has been an excellent special teamer this year. If you go back to the end of training camp, one of the things that I said frequently when the Jets were trying to figure out their final roster was that it was difficult to justify keeping Stiggers at corner. Because I think in many ways that last roster spot came down to Stiggers versus Jarek Bernard-Converse. Converse was clearly the better corner. But I agreed with the decision to keep Stiggers because Stiggers just looked like a phenomenal special teamer. And if you look at the way the Jets are playing coverage this year, I mean, he's in the middle of a lot of big plays in the coverage units. I think that one of the sequences in this game that kind of flew under the radar came in the final 2 minutes. It was after the Jets tied, and these teams traded punts. Usually you don't get multiple possessions by both teams in the final 2 minutes, but that happened in this game, and the Jets ended up getting themselves pinned back pretty deep. Austin McNamara unleashed a 55-yard punt, and the Jets were able to make a tackle after a 1-yard return. So they netted 54 yards on this punt return. It helped flip field position because a bad punt in that situation by McNamara, and Atlanta's going to be on the cusp of field goal range, if not in field goal range. That's the type of situation where you could lose a game because the Jets were punting from their own 13. And Stiggers was the guy that made the tackle to limit the return to 1 yard. And that ended up being a 54-yard net gain for the Jets on that play. It was a huge play. It took the Jets from their own 13 to the Falcons starting a drive on their off 32. And that gave the Jets defense some breathing room. And the Jets defense delivered. They forced a 3-and-out. And then Atlanta only got off a 40-yard punt. Isaiah Williams returned it for 16 yards. So between Stiggers and Williams, Jets netted 30 yards. Stiggers made a tackle after a 1-yard punt return on a 55-yard punt. That netted the Jets 54 yards. Stiggers was a part of the role along with Austin McNamara, who hit a great punt to flip field position. Jets netted 54 yards. And Isaiah Williams' 16-yard return on the ensuing Atlanta punt meant that the Falcons only netted 24 yards. So the Jets gained 30 yards in field position from their special teams play at the end of the game. And that left the Jets in a position where they only needed to move the ball 19 yards to get into field goal range. Think about it. The Jets gained, if you really think about it, the Jets gained 49 yards. Only 19 were gained by the offense. 30 yards were gained by their punt coverage unit and their punt return unit. I talk a lot about special teams has like this hidden role in winning games. And sometimes it's subtle, but that's one where it's maybe not so subtle, where the Jets gained 30 yards on their punt return on back-to-back sequences with their punt coverage unit and their punt return units. And they helped an offense that was kind of erratic outside of Adonai Mitchell get into field goal range for a winning kick. And then Nick Folk delivered it. Sometimes special teams plays a big role in wins. And the Jets may not be a very good team right now, but they're hoping to get there. They have the resources to get to and become a very good team in the next year or two. And if they do, this type of special teams play can help swing big games. When you're a good team playing a good team, the games tend to be a very narrow margin, tends to be a very narrow path to victory. And sometimes it's the little things like special teams play. Sometimes it's guys like Nick Folk making kicks, and Folk's at the end of his career. Maybe the Jets could talk him into kicking one more year. Sometimes it's Austin your punt coverage unit, a good punter in Austin McNamara, a great find by Aaron Glenn and Darren Muji. Qwan'tez Stiggers, an excellent coverage guy. Didn't just fall on the punt, had the huge tackle in the fourth quarter. And then return guys like Isaiah Williams and Kene Nwangwu when Nwangwu's in the lineup. Jet special teams, outside of Adonai Mitchell, those guys were the stars of the game, and they deserve a lot of credit for this victory. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy the day. Enjoy your victory Monday. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.